How Much Land Does a Man Need? By Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. 1. An elder sister came to visit her younger sister in the country. The elder was married to a tradesman in town, the younger to a peasant in the village. As the sisters sat over their tea talking, the elder began to boast of the advantages of town life, saying how comfortable they lived there, how well they dressed, what fine clothes their children wore, what good things they ate and drank, and how she went to the theater, promenades, and entertainments. The younger sister was piqued, and in turn disparaged the life of a tradesman, and stood up for that of a peasant. "I would not change my way of life for yours," she said. "We may live roughly, but at least we are free from anxiety. You live in better style than we do. But though you often earn more than you need, you are very likely to lose all you have. You know the proverb, 'Loss and gain are brothers twain.' It often happens that people who are wealthy one day are begging their bread the next. Our way is safer. Though a peasant's life is not a fat one, it is a long one. We shall never grow rich, but we shall always have enough to eat." The elder sister said sneeringly, "Enough? Yes, if you like to share with the pigs and the calves. What do you know of elegance or manners? However much your good man may slave, you will die as you are living, on a dung-heap, and your children the same." "Well, what of that?" replied the younger. "Of course our work is rough and coarse, but on the other hand it is sure, and we need not bow to anyone. But you, in your towns, are surrounded by temptations. Today all may be right, but tomorrow the evil one may tempt your husband with cards, wine, or women, and all will go to ruin. Don't such things happen often enough?" Pahom, the master of the house, was lying on the top of the stove, and he listened to the women's chatter. "It is perfectly true," he thought. "Busy as we are from childhood tilling Mother Earth, we peasants have no time to let any nonsense settle in our heads. Our only trouble is that we haven't land enough. If I had plenty of land, I shouldn't fear the devil himself." The women finished their tea, chatted a while about dress, and then cleared away the tea things and lay down to sleep. But the devil had been sitting behind the oven, and had heard all that was said. He was pleased that the peasant's wife had led their husband into boasting, and that he had said that if he had plenty of land he would not fear the devil himself. "All right," thought the devil, "we will have a tussle. I'll give you land enough, and by means of that land I will get you into my power." 2. Close to the village there lived a lady, a small landowner, who had an estate of about 300 acres. She had always lived on good terms with the peasants, until she engaged as her steward an old soldier, who took to the burdening of the people with fines. However careful Pahom tried to be, it happened again and again that now a horse of his got the lady's oats, now a cow strayed into her garden, now his calves found their way into her meadows, and he always had to pay a fine. Pahom paid but grumbled, and going home in a temper was rough on his family. All through that summer Pahom had much trouble because of this steward, and he wasn't even glad when winter came and the cattle had to be stabled. Though he grudged the fodder when they could no longer graze on the pasture land, at least he was free from anxiety about them. In the winter the news got about that the lady was going to sell her land, and that the keeper of the inn on the high road was bargaining for it. When the peasants heard this, they were very much alarmed. "Well," they thought, "if the innkeeper gets the land, he will worry us with fines worse than the lady's steward. We all depend on that estate." So the peasants went on behalf of their commune and asked the lady not to sell the land to the innkeeper, offering her a better price for it themselves. The lady agreed to let them have it. Then the peasants tried to arrange for the commune to buy the whole estate, so that it might be held by all in common. They met twice to discuss it, but could not settle on the matter. The evil one sowed discord among them, and they could not agree. So they decided to buy the land individually, each according to his means, and the lady agreed to this plan as she had to the other. Presently Pahom heard that a neighbor of his was buying 50 acres, and that the lady had considered to accept one half in cash and to wait a year for the other half. Pahom felt envious. "Look at that," he thought. "The land is all being sold, and I shall get none of it." So he spoke to his wife. "Other people are buying," said he, "and we must also buy 20 acres or so. Life is becoming impossible. That steward is simply crushing us with his fines." So they put their heads together and considered how they could manage to buy it. They had 100 roubles laid by. They sold a colt and one half of their bees, hired out one of their sons as a laborer, and took his wages in advance, borrowed the rest from a brother-in-law, and so scraped together half the purchase price. Having done this, Pahom chose out a farm of 40 acres, some of it wooded, and went to the lady to bargain for it. They came to an agreement, and he shook hands with her upon it, and paid her a deposit in advance. Then they went to town and signed the deeds, he paying half the price down, and undertaking to pay the remainder within 2 years. So now Pahom had land of his own. He borrowed seed and sowed it on the land he had bought. The harvest was a good one, and within a year he had managed to pay off his debts both to the lady and to his brother-in-law. So he became a landowner, plowing and sowing his own land, making hay on his own land, cutting his own trees, and feeding his cattle on his own pasture. When he went out to plow his fields, or to look at his growing corn, or at his grassy meadows, his heart would fill with joy. The grass that grew and the flowers that bloomed there seemed to him unlike any that grew elsewhere. Formerly, when he had passed by the land, it had appeared the same as any other land, but now it seemed quite different. 3. So Pahom was well contented, and everything would have been right if the neighboring peasants would not have trespassed on his cornfields and meadows. He appealed to them most civilly, but they still went on. Now the communal herdsman would let the village cows stray into his meadows. Then the horses from the night pasture would get among his corn. Pahom turned them out again and again, and forgave their owners, and for a long time he forbore from prosecuting anyone. But at last he lost patience and complained to the district court. He knew it was the peasants' want of land and no evil intent on their part that caused the trouble. But he thought, "I cannot go on overlooking it, or they will destroy all I have. They must be taught a lesson." So he had them up, gave them one lesson and then another, and 2 or 3 of the peasants were fined. After a time Pahom's neighbors began to bear him a grudge for this, and would now and then let their cattle on his land on purpose. One peasant even got into Pahom's wood at night and cut down 5 young lime trees for their bark. Pahom passed through the wood one day, noticing something white. He came nearer and saw the stripped trees lying on the ground, and close by stood the stumps where the trees had been. Pahom was furious. "If he had only cut one here and there, it would have been bad enough," thought Pahom. "But the rascal has actually cut down a whole clump. If I could only find out who did this, I would pay him out." He racked his brains as to who it could be. Finally he decided, "It must be Simon. No one else could have done it." So he went to Simon's homestead to have a look around. but he found nothing, and only had an angry scene. However, he now felt more certain than ever that Simon had done it, and he lodged a complaint. Simon was summoned. The case was tried and retried, and at the end of it all Simon was acquitted, there being no evidence against him. Paham felt still more aggrieved, and let his anger loose upon the elder and the judges. "You let thieves grease your palms," he said. "If you were honest folk yourselves, you would not let a thief go free." So Paham quarreled with the judges and with his neighbors. Threats to burn his building began to be uttered, so though Paham had much more land, his place in the commune was much worse than before. About this time a rumor got around that many people were moving to new parts. "There's no need for me to leave my land," thought Paham. "But some of the others might leave our village, and then there would be more room for us. I would take over their land myself and make my estate a little bigger. I could then live more at ease. As it is, I am still too cramped to be comfortable." One day Paham was sitting at home when a peasant passing through the village happened to call in. He was allowed to stay the night, and supper was given him. Paham had a talk with this peasant, and asked him where he had come from. The stranger answered that he came from beyond the Volga, where he had been working. One word led to another, and the man went on to say that many people were settling in those parts. He told how some people from his village had settled there. They had joined the commune, and had 25 acres per man granted them. The land was so good, he said, that the rye sown on it grew as high as a horse, and so thick that 5 cuts of a sickle made a sheaf. One peasant, he said, had brought nothing with him but his bare hands, and now he had 6 horses and 2 cows of his own. Paham's heart kindled with desire. He thought, "Why should I suffer in this narrow hole if one can live so well elsewhere? I will sell my land and my homestead here, and with the money I will start afresh over there and get everything new. In this crowded place one is always having trouble. But I must first go and find out all about it myself." Toward summer he got ready and started. He went down the Volga on a steamer to Samara. They walked another 300 miles on foot, and at last reached the place. It was just as the stranger had said. The peasants had plenty of land. Every man had 25 acres of communal land given him for his use, and anyone who had money could buy besides, at 50 cents an acre, as much good freehold land as he wanted. Having found out all he wished to know, Paham returned home as autumn came, and began selling off his belongings. He sold his land at a profit, sold his homestead and all his cattle, and withdrew from membership in the commune. He only waited till the spring, and then started with his family for the new settlement. 4. As soon as Paham and his family arrived at their new abode, he applied for admission to the commune of a large village. He stood treat to the elders, and obtained the necessary documents. 5 shares of communal land were given him for his own and his son's use, that is to say, 125 acres, not altogether, but in different fields, besides the use of the communal pasture. Paham put up the buildings he needed and bought cattle. Of the communal land alone he had 3 times as much as his former home, and the land was good corn land. He was 10 times better off than he had been. He had plenty of arable land and pasturage, and could keep as many head of cattle as he liked. At first, in the bustle of building and settling down, Paham was pleased with it all, but when he got used to it he began to think that even here he had not land enough. The first year he sowed wheat on his share of the communal land and had a good crop. He wanted to go on sowing wheat, but he had not enough communal land for the purpose, and what he had already used was not available, for in those parts wheat is only sown on virgin soil or on fallow land. It is sown for 1 or 2 years, and then the land lies fallow till it is again overgrown with prairie grass. There were many who wanted such land, and there was not enough for all, so that the people quarreled about it. Those who were better off wanted it for growing wheat, and those who were poor wanted to let to dealers, so that they might raise money to pay their taxes. Paham wanted to sow more wheat, so he rented land from a dealer for a year. He sowed much wheat and had a fine crop, but the land was too far from the village, and wheat had to be carted more than 10 miles. After a time, Paham noticed that some peasant dealers were living on separate farms and were growing wealthy, and he thought, "If I were to buy some freehold land and have a homestead on it, it would be a different thing altogether. Then it would all be nice and compact." The question of buying freehold land reoccurred to him again and again. He went on in the same way for 3 years, renting land and sowing wheat. The seasons turned out well and the crops were good, so that he began to lay money by. He might have gone on living contentedly, but he grew tired of having to rent other people's land every year, and having to scramble for it. Wherever there was good land to be had, the peasants would rush for it, and it was taken up at once, so that unless you were sharp about it, you got none. It happened in the 3rd year that he and a dealer together rented a piece of pasture land from some peasants, and they had already plowed it up when there was some dispute, and the peasants went to law about it, and things fell out so that the labor was all lost. "If it were my own land," thought Paham, "I should be independent, and there would not be all this unpleasantness." So Paham began looking out for land which he could buy, and he came across a peasant who had bought 1,300 acres, but having got into difficulty was willing to sell again cheap. Paham bargained and haggled with him, and at last they settled on the price of 1,500 rubles, part in cash and part to be paid later. They had all but clinched the matter when a passing dealer happened to stop at Paham's one day to get a feed for his horse. He drank tea with Paham, and they had a talk. The dealer said that he was just returning from the land of the Bashkirs, far away, where he had bought 13,000 acres of land for 1,000 rubles. Paham questioned him further, and the tradesman said, "All one needs is to make friends with the chiefs. I gave away about 100 rubles worth of dressing gowns and carpets, besides a case of tea, and I gave wine to those who would drink it, and I got the land for less than 2 cents an acre." And he showed Paham the title deed, saying, "The land lies near a river, and the whole prairie is virgin soil." Paham plied him with questions, and the tradesman said, "There is more land there than you could cover if you walked a year, and it all belongs to the Bashkirs. They are as simple as sheep, and land can be got almost for nothing." "There now," thought Paham, "with my 1,000 rubles, why should I get only 1,300 acres, and saddle myself with debt besides? If I take it out there, I can get more than 10 times as much for the money." 5. Paham inquired how to get to the place, and as soon as the tradesman had left him, he prepared to go there himself. He left his wife to look after the homestead and started on his journey, taking his man with him. They stopped at a town on the way and bought a case of tea, some wine, and other presents, as the tradesman had advised. On and on they went until they had gone more than 300 miles, and on the 7th day they came to a place where the Bashkirs had pitched their tents. It was all just as the tradesman had said. The people lived on the steppes by a river, in felt-covered tents. They neither tilled the ground nor ate bread. Their cattle and horses grazed in herds on the steppe. The colts were tethered behind the tents, and the mares were driven to them twice a day. The mares were milked, and from the milk kumiss was made. It was the women who prepared kumiss, and they also made cheese. As far as the men were concerned, drinking kumiss and tea, eating mutton, and playing on their pipes was all they cared about. They were all stout and merry, and all the summer long they never thought of doing any work. They were quite ignorant, and knew no Russian, but were good-natured enough. As soon as they saw Paham, they came out of their tents and gathered round their visitor. An interpreter was found, and Paham told them that he had come about some land. The Bashkirs seemed very glad. They took Paham and led him into one of their best tents, where they made him sit on some down cushions placed on a carpet, while they sat around him. They gave him tea and kumiss, and had a sheep killed, and gave him mutton to eat. Paham took presents out of his cart and distributed them among the Bashkirs, and divided amongst them the tea. The Bashkirs were delighted. They talked a great deal among themselves, and they told the interpreter to translate. "They wish to tell you," said the interpreter, "that they like you, and that it is our custom to do all we can to please a guest and to repay him for his gifts. You have given us presents. Now tell us which of the things we possess pleases you best, that we may present them to you." "What pleases me best here is your land," answered Paham. "Our land is crowded and the soil is exhausted, but you have plenty of land, and it is good land. I never saw a like of it." The interpreter translated. The Bashkirs talked among themselves for a while. Paham could not understand what they were saying, but he saw that they were much amused, and that they shouted and laughed. Then they were silent and looked at Paham, while the interpreter said, "They wish me to tell you that in return for your presents they will gladly give you as much land as you want. You have only to point it out with your hand, and it is yours." The Bashkirs talked again for a while and began to dispute. Paham asked what they were disputing about, and the interpreter told him that some of them thought they ought to ask their chief about the land and not act in his absence, while others thought that there was no need to wait for his return. 6. While the Bashkirs were disputing, a man in a large fox fur cap appeared on the scene. They all became silent and rose to their feet. The interpreter said, "This is our chief himself." Paham immediately fetched the best dressing-gown and 5 pounds of tea, and offered them to the chief. The chief accepted them and seated himself in the place of honor. The Bashkirs at once began telling him something. The chief listened for a while, and then made a sign with his head for them to be silent, and addressing himself to Paham, said in Russian, "Well, let it be so. Choose whatever piece of land you like. We have plenty of it." "How can I take as much as I like?" thought Paham. "I must get a deed to make it secure, or else they may say, 'It is yours,' and afterwards take it away again." "Thank you for your kind words," he said aloud. "You have much land and I only want a little, but I should like to be sure which bit is mine. Could it be measured and made over to me? Life and death are in God's hands. You good people give it to me, but your children might wish to take it away again." "You are quite right," said the chief. "We will make it over to you." "I heard that a dealer had been here," continued Paham, "and that you gave him a little land too, and signed title deeds to that effect. I should like to have it done in the same way." The chief understood. "Yes, that can be done quite easily. We have a scribe, and we will go to town with you and have the deed properly sealed." "And what will be the price?" asked Paham. "Our price is always the same, 1,000 rubles a day." Paham did not understand. "A day? What measure is that? How many acres would that make?" "We do not know how to reckon it out. We sell it by the day. As much as you can go round in your feet in a day is yours, and the price is 1,000 rubles a day." Paham was surprised.
But in a day you can get a large tract of
he
land.
said. The chief laughed.
It will be all yours. But there is one condition. If you don't return on the same day to the spot whence you started, your money is lost. But how am I going to mark the way that I've gone? Why, we shall go to any spot you like and stay there. You must start from that spot and make your round, taking a spade with you. Whenever you think necessary, make a mark. At every turning, dig a hole and pile up the turf. Then afterwards we will go round with a plough from hole to hole. You may make as large a circuit as you please. But before the sun sets, you must return to the place you started from. All the land you cover will be yours."
Paham was delighted. It was decided to start early next morning. They talked a while, and after drinking some more kumiss and eating some more mutton, they had tea again, and then the night came on. They gave Paham a feather bed to sleep on, and the Bashkirs dispersed for the night, promising to assemble the next morning at daybreak and ride out before sunrise to the appointed spot. 7. Paham lay on the feather bed, but could not sleep. He kept thinking about the land.
"What a large tract I will mark off,"
He thought.
"I can easily go 35 miles a day. The days are long now, and with a circuit of 35 miles, what a lot of land there will be! I will sell the poorer land or let it to peasants, but I'll pick out the best and farm it, and I will buy 2 ox teams and hire 2 more laborers. About 150 acres shall be plowland, and I will pasture cattle on the rest."
Paham lay awake all night and dozed off only just before dawn. Hardly were his eyes closed when he had a dream. He thought he was lying in the same tent and heard somebody chuckling outside. He wondered who it could be, and rose and went out. He saw the Bashkir chief sitting in front of the tent, holding his side and rolling about with laughter. Going near the chief, Paham asked. But he saw that it was no longer the chief, but the dealer who had recently stopped at his house and had told him about the land. Just as Paham was about to ask,
"Have you been here long?"
he saw that it was not the dealer, but the peasant who had come up from the Volga long ago to Paham's old home. Then he saw that it was not the peasant either, but the devil himself with hoofs and horns, sitting there and chuckling. And before him lay a man barefoot, prostrate on the ground, with only trousers and a shirt on. And Paham dreamt that he looked more attentively to see what sort of man it was lying there, and he saw that the man was dead, and that it was himself. He awoke horror-struck.
What
What
things
things
one does
dream,
dream.
he thought. Looking round, he saw through the open door that the dawn was breaking.
It's time to wake them up,
thought he.
We ought to be
starting. He got up, roused his man, who was sleeping in his cart, bade him harness, and went to call the Bashkirs.
It's time to go to the steppes to measure
He said. The Bashkirs rose and assembled, and the chief came too. Then they began drinking kumiss again, and offered Paham some tea, but he would not wait.
"If we are to go, let us go. It is high time,"
he said. 8. The Bashkirs got ready, and they all started, some mounted on horses and some in carts. Paham drove in his own small cart with his servant and took a spade with him. When they reached the steppe, the morning red was beginning to kindle. They ascended a hillock, called by the Bashkirs a shikan, and dismounted from their carts, and their horses gathered in one spot. The chief came up to Paham and stretched out his arm towards the plain.
"See,"
said he,
"all this, as far as your eyes can reach, is ours. You may have any part of it that you like."
Paham's eyes glistened. It was all virgin soil, as flat as the palm of your hand, as black as the seed of a poppy, and in the hollows different kinds of grasses grew breast high. The chief took off his fox fur cap, placed it on the ground, and said, "This will be the mark. Start from here, and return here again. All the land you go round shall be yours." Paham took out his money and put it in the cap, and then he took off his outer coat. He unfastened his girdle and tied it tight below his stomach, put a little bag of bread into the breast of his coat, and tying a flask of water into his girdle, he drew up the tops of his boots, took the spade from his man, and stood ready to start. He considered for some moments which way he had better go. It was tempting everywhere. "No matter," he concluded. "I will go towards the rising sun." He turned his face to the east, stretched himself, and waited for the sun to appear above the rim. "I must lose no time," he thought, "and it is easier walking while it is still cool." The sun's rays had hardly flashed above the horizon before Paham, carrying the spade over his shoulder, went down into the steppe. Paham started walking neither slowly nor quickly. After having gone 1,000 yards, he stopped, dug a hole, and placed pieces of turf one on another to make it more visible. Then he went on, and now that he had walked off his stiffness, he quickened his pace, and after a while he dug another hole. Paham looked back. The hillock could be seen distinctly in the sunlight, with people on it, and the glittering tires of the cartwheels. At a rough guess, Paham concluded that he had walked 3 miles. It was growing warmer. He took off his undercoat, flung it across his shoulder, and went on again. It had grown quite warm now. He looked at the sun. It was time to think of breakfast. "The first shift is done, but there are 4 in a day, and it's too soon yet to turn. I will just have to take off my boots." He sat down, took off his boots, stuck them into his girdle, and went on. It was easy walking now. "I will go on for another 3 miles," he thought, "and then turn to the left. The spot is so fine, that would be a pity to lose it. The further one goes, the better the land seems." He went straight on for a while, and when he looked round, the hillock was scarcely visible, and the people on it looked like black ants, and he could just see something glistening there in the sun. "Ah," thought Paham, "I have gone far enough in this direction. It is time to turn. Besides, I am in a regular sweat, and very thirsty." He stopped, dug a large hole, and heaped up pieces of turf. Next he untied his flask, had a drink, and then turned sharply to the left. He went on and on. The grass was high, and it was very hot. Paham began to grow tired. He looked at the sun and saw that it was noon. "Well, I must have a rest." He sat down and ate some bread and drank some water, but he did not lie down, thinking that if he did he might fall asleep. After sitting a little while, he went on again. At first he walked easily. The food had strengthened him, but it had become terribly hot, and he felt sleepy. Still he went on, thinking, "An hour to suffer, a lifetime to live." He went a long way in his direction also, and was about to turn to the left again when he perceived a damp hollow. "It would be a pity to leave that out," he thought. "Flax would do well there." So he went on past the hollow, and dug a hole on the other side of it before he turned the corner. Paham looked towards the hillock. The heat had made the air hazy. It seemed to be quivering, and through the haze the people on the hillock could scarcely be seen. "Ah," thought Paham, "I have made the sides too long. I must take this one shorter." And he went along the third side, stepping faster. He looked at the sun. It was nearly halfway to the horizon, and he had not yet done 2 miles on the third side of the square. He was still 10 miles from the goal. "No," he thought, "though it will make my land lopsided, I must hurry back in a straight line now. I might go too far, and as it is, I have a great deal of land." So Paham hurriedly dug a hole and turned straight towards the hillock. 9. Paham went straight towards the hillock, but now he walked with difficulty. He was done up with the heat, his bare feet were cut and bruised, and his legs began to fail. He longed to rest, but it was impossible if he meant to get back before sunset. The sun waits for no man, and it was sinking lower and lower.
"Oh dear,"
he thought.
"if only I have not blundered trying for too much. What if I am too late?"
He looked towards the hillock and at the sun. He was still far from his goal, and the sun was already near the rim. Paham walked on and on. It was very hard walking, and he went quicker and quicker. He pressed on, but he was still far from the place. He began running, threw away his coat, his boots, his flask, and his cap, and kept only the spade, which he used as a support.
"What shall I do?"
he thought again.
"I have grasped too much and ruined the whole affair. I can't get back there before the sun sets."
And this fear made him still more breathless. Paham went on running. His soaking shirt and trousers stuck to him, and his mouth was parched. His breast was working like a blacksmith's bellows. His heart was beating like a hammer, and his legs were giving way as if they did not belong to him. Paham was seized with terror lest he should die of the strain. Though afraid of death, he could not stop.
"After having run all that way, they will call me a fool if I stop now,"
thought he, and he ran on, and drew near and heard the Bashkirs yelling and shouting at him, and their cries inflamed his heart still more. He gathered his last strength and ran on. The sun was close to the rim, and cloaked in mist looked large and as red as blood. Now, yes, now it was about to set. The sun was quite low, but he was also quite near his aim. Paham could already see the people on the hillock waving their arms to hurry him up. He could see the fox-fur cap on the ground, and the money on it, and the chief sitting on the ground holding his sides, and Paham remembering his dream.
"There is plenty of land,"
thought he,
"but will God let me live on it? I have lost my life. I have lost my life. I shall never reach that spot."
Paham looked at the sun, which had reached the earth. One side of it had already disappeared. With all his remaining strength he rushed on, bending his body forward so that his legs could hardly follow fast enough to keep him from falling. Just as he had reached the hillock, it suddenly grew dark. He looked up. The sun had already set. He gave a cry.
"All my labor has been in vain,"
thought he, and was about to stop, but he heard the Bashkirs still shouting, and remembering that though to him from below the sun seemed to have set, they on the hillock could still see it. He took a long breath and ran up the hillock. It was still light there. He reached the top and saw the cap, and before it sat the chief, laughing and holding his sides. Again Paham remembered his dream, and he uttered a cry. His legs gave way beneath him. He fell forward and reached the cap with his hand.
"Oh, what a fine fellow!"
exclaimed the chief.
"He has gained much land."
Paham's servant came running up and tried to raise him, but he saw that blood was flowing from his mouth. Paham was dead. The Bashkirs clicked their tongues to show their pity. His servant picked up the spade and dug a grave long enough for Paham to lie in, and buried him in it. 6 feet from his head to his heels was all he needed. End of How Much Land Does a Man Need by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. Coat and his breakfast. He lifted the coat, but the bread was gone. He looked and looked, turned the coat over, shook it out, but the bread was gone. The peasant could not make this out at all.
"That's strange," thought he. "I saw no one, but all the same some one has been here and has taken the bread." It was an imp who had stolen the bread, while the peasant was ploughing, and at that moment he was sitting behind the bush, waiting to hear the peasant swear and call on the devil. The peasant was sorry to lose his breakfast, but "It can't be helped," said he. "After all, I shan't die of hunger. No, I doubt whoever took the bread needed it. May it do him good." And he went to the well, had a drink of water, and rested a bit. Then he caught his horse, harnessed it, and began ploughing again. The imp was crestfallen at not having made the peasant sin, and he went to report what had happened to the devil, his master. He came to the devil and told him he had taken the peasant's bread, and how the peasant, instead of cursing, had said, "May it do him good." The devil was angry, and replied, "If the man got the better of you, it was your own fault. You don't understand your business. If the peasants, and their wives after them, take to that sort of thing, it will be all up with us. The matter can't be left like that. Go back at once," said he, "and put things right. If in 3 years you don't get the better of the peasant, I'll have you ducked in holy water." The imp was frightened. He scampered back to earth, thinking how he could redeem his fault. He thought and thought, and at last hit upon a good plan. He turned himself into a laboring man, and went and took service with the poor peasant. The first year he advised the peasant to sow corn in a marshy place. The peasant took his advice and sowed in the marsh. The year turned out a very dry one, and the crops of the other peasants were all scorched by the sun, but the poor peasant's corn grew thick and tall and full-eared. Not only had he gained enough to last him the whole year, but he had much left over besides. The next year the imp advised the peasant to sow on the hill, and it turned out a wet summer. Other people's corn was beaten down and rotted, and the ears did not fill. But the peasant's crop up on the hill was a fine one. He had more grain left over than before, so that he did not know what to do with it all. Then the imp showed the peasant how he could mash the grain and distill spirit from it, and the peasant made strong drink, and began to drink it himself and to give it to his friends. So the imp went to the devil, his master, and boasted that he had made up for his failure. The devil said he would come and see for himself how the case stood. He came to the peasant's house, and saw that the peasant had invited his well-to-do neighbors and was treating them to drink. His wife was offering the drink to the guests, and as she handed it round, she tumbled against the table and spilt a glassful. The peasant was angry. He scolded his wife. "What do you mean, you slut? Do you think it's dishwater, you cripple, that you must go pouring stuff like that over the floor?" The imp nudged the devil, his master, with his elbow. "See," he said, "that's the man who did not grudge his last crust." The peasant, still railing at his wife, began to carry the drink around himself. Just then a poor peasant returning from work came in uninvited. He greeted the company, sat down, and saw that they were drinking. Tired with his day's work, he felt that he too would like a drop. He sat, and his mouth kept watering. But the host, instead of offering him any, only muttered, "I can't find drink for everyone who comes along." This pleased the devil, but the imp chuckled and said, "Wait a bit, there's more to come yet." The rich peasants drank, and their host drank too, and they began to make false, oily speeches to one another. The devil listened and praised the imp. "If," said he, The drink makes them so foxy that they begin to cheat each other. They will soon all be in our hands." "Wait for what's next," said the imp. "Let them have another glass all round. Now they are like foxes, wagging their tails and trying to get round one another. But presently you will see them like savage wolves." The peasants had another glass each, and their talk became wilder and rougher. Instead of oily speeches, they began to abuse and snarl at one another. Soon they took to fighting, and punched one another's noses. And the host joined in the fight, and he too got well beaten. The devil looked on, and was much pleased at all this. "This is first rate," said he. But the imp replied, "Wait a bit. The best is yet to come. Wait till they have had a third glass. Now they are like raving wolves, but let them have one more glass, and they will be like swine." The peasants had their third glass, and became quite like brutes. They muttered and shouted, not knowing why, and not listening to one another. Then the party began to break up. Some went home, some in twos, and some in threes, all staggering down the street. The host went out to speed his guests, but he fell on his nose into a puddle, smeared himself from top to toe, and lay there, grunting like a hog. This pleased the devil still more. "Well," said he, "you have hit on a first-rate drink, and have quite made up for your blunder about the bread. But now, tell me how this drink is made. You must first have put in fox's blood. That was what made the peasants sly as foxes. Then I suppose you added wolf's blood. That was what made them fierce like wolves. And you must have finished off with swine's blood, to make them behave like swine." "No," said the imp, "that was not the way I did it. All I did was to see that the peasant had more corn than they needed. The blood of the beasts is always in man, but as long as he has only enough corn for his needs, it is kept in bounds. While that was the case, the peasant did not grudge his last crust. But when he had corn left over, he looked for ways of getting pleasure out of it. And I showed him a pleasure, drinking. And when he began to turn God's good gifts into spirits for his own pleasure, the foxes, wolves, and swine's blood in him all came out. If only he goes on drinking, he will always be a beast." The devil praised the imp. The devil praised the imp, forgave him for his former blunder, and advanced him to a post of high honor. End of The Imp and the Crust by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. Little Girls Wiser Than Men by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. It was an early Easter. Sledging was just over. Snow still lay in the yards, and water ran in streams down the village street. Two little girls from different houses happened to meet in a lane between two homesteads, where the dirty water, after running through the farmlands, had formed large puddles. One little girl was very small, the other a little bigger. Their mothers had dressed them both in new frocks. The little one wore a blue frock, the other a yellow print, and both had red kerchiefs on their heads. They had just come from church when they met, and first they showed each other their finery, and then they began to play. Soon the fancy took them to splash about in the water, and the smaller one was going to step into the puddle, shoes and all, when the elder checked her. "Don't go in so, Malasha," she said. "Your mother will scold you. I will take off my shoes and stockings, and you take off yours." They did so, and then, picking up their skirts, began walking towards each other through the puddle. The water came up to Malasha's ankles, and she said, "It is deep, Akulia. I'm afraid." "Come on," replied the other. "Don't be afraid. It won't get any deeper." When they got near one another, Akulia said, "Mind, Malasha, don't splash. Walk carefully." She had hardly said this when Malasha pumped down her foot so that the water splashed right onto Akulia's frock. The frock was splashed, and so were Akulia's eyes and nose. When she saw the stains on her frock, she was angry and ran after Malasha to strike her. Malasha was frightened, and seeing that she had got herself into trouble, she scrambled out of the puddle and prepared to run home. Just then Akulia's mother happened to be passing, and seeing that her daughter's skirt was splashed and her sleeves dirty, she said, "You naughty, dirty girl, what have you been doing?" "Malasha did it on purpose," replied the girl. At this Akulia's mother seized Malasha and struck her on the back of her neck. Malasha began to howl so that she could be heard all down the street. Her mother came out. "What are you beating my girl for?" she said, and began scolding her neighbor. One word led to another, and they had an angry quarrel. The men came out, and a crowd collected on the street, everyone shouting and no one listening. They all went on quarreling till one gave another a push, and the affair had very nearly come to blows when Akulia's old grandmother, stepping in among them, tried to calm them. They would not listen to the old woman, and nearly knocked her off her feet. And she would not have been able to quiet the crowd if it had not been for Akulia and Malasha themselves. While the women were abusing each other, Akulia had wiped the mud off her frock and gone back to the puddle. She took a stone and began scraping away the earth in front of the puddle to make a channel through which the water could run out into the street. Presently Malasha joined her, and with a chip of wood helped her to dig the channel. Just as the men were beginning to fight, the water from the little girl's channel ran streaming into the street towards the very place where the old woman was trying to pacify the men. The girls followed it, one running each side of the stream. "Catch it, Malasha, catch it!" shouted Akulia, while Malasha could not speak for laughing. Highly delighted in watching the chip float along on their stream, the little girls ran straight into the group of men, and the old woman, seeing this, said to the men, "Are you not ashamed of yourselves to go fighting on account of these lassies when they themselves have forgotten all about it, and are playing happily together? Dear souls, they are wiser than you." The men looked at the little girls and were ashamed, and, laughing at themselves, went back each to his own home. "Except ye turn and become like little children, ye shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven." End of Little Girls Wiser Than Men. Read by Alan Davis Drake. The Repentant Sinner by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. There was once a man who lived for 70 years in the world, and lived in sin all that time. He fell ill, but even then did not repent. Only at the last moment, as he was dying, he wept and said, "Lord, forgive me, as thou forgavest the thief upon the cross." And as he said these words, his soul left his body, and the soul of the sinner, feeling love towards God and faith in his mercy, went to the gates of heaven and knocked, praying to be let into the heavenly kingdom. Then a voice spoke within the gate. What man is it that knocks at the gates of paradise, and what deeds did he do during his life? And the voice of the accuser replied, recounting all the man's evil deeds, and not a single good one. And the voice from within the gates answered, Sinners cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. Go hence. And then the man said, Lord, I hear thy voice, but cannot see thy face, nor do I know thy name. The voice answered, I am Peter the apostle. And the sinner replied, Have pity on me, Apostle Peter. Remember man's weakness and God's mercy. Wert not thou a disciple of Christ? Didst not thou hear his teaching from his own lips? And hadst thou not his example before thee? Remember then how, when he sorrowed and was grieved in spirit, and 3 times asked thee, Keep away and pray, thou didst sleep, because thine eyes were heavy, and 3 times he found thee sleeping. So it was with me. Remember also how thou didst promise to be faithful unto death, and did thrice deny him when he was taken before Caiaphas. So it was with me. And remember too how when the cock crowed thou didst go out and didst weep bitterly. So it is with me. Thou canst not refuse to let me in. And the voice behind the gate was silent. Then the sinner stood a little while, and again began to knock, and to ask to be let into the kingdom of heaven. And he heard another voice behind the gates, which said, Who is this man, and how did he live on earth? And the voice of the accuser again repeated all the sinner's evil deeds, and not a single good one. And the voice from behind the gates replied, Go hence. Such sinners cannot live with us in paradise. Then the sinner said, Lord, I hear thy voice, but I see thee not, nor do I know thy name. And the voice answered, I am David, king and prophet. The sinner did not despair, nor did he leave the gates of paradise, but said, Have pity on me, King David. Remember men's weakness and God's mercy. God loved thee and exalted thee among men. Thou hadst all, a kingdom, and honor and riches, and wives and children. But thou sawest from thy housetop the wife of a poor man, and sin entered into thee, and thou tookest the wife of Uriah, and didst slay him with the sword of the Ammonites. Thou, a rich man, didst take from the poor man his 1 ewe lamb, and didst kill him. I have done likewise. Remember then how thou didst repent, and how thou saidst, I acknowledge my transgressions, my sin is ever before me. I have done the same. Thou canst not refuse to let me in. And the voice from within the gates was silent. The sinner, having stood still a little while, began knocking again, and asked to be let into the kingdom of heaven. And a third voice was heard within the gates, saying, Who is this man, and how has he spent his life on earth? And the voice of the accuser replied for the 3rd time, recounting the sinner's evil deeds, and not mentioning one good one. And the voice within the gates said, Depart hence. Sinners cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And the sinner said, Thy voice I hear, but thy face I see not, neither do I know thy name. Then the voice replied, I am John the Divine, the beloved disciple of Christ. And the sinner rejoiced and said, Now surely I shall be allowed to enter. Peter and David must let me in, because they know man's weakness and God's mercy. And thou wilt let me in, because thou lovest much. Was it not thou, John the Divine, who wrote that God is love, and that he who loves not knows not God? And in thine old age didst thou not say unto men, Brethren, love one another? How then canst thou look at me with hatred, and drive me away? Either thou must renounce what thou hast said, or loving me must let me enter the kingdom of heaven. And the gates of paradise opened, and John embraced the repentant sinner and took him into the kingdom of heaven. Read by Alan Davis Drake in Cloud Mountain Studios. Too Dear by Leo Tolstoy. Near the borders of France and Italy, on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, lies a tiny little kingdom called Monaco. Many a small country town can boast more inhabitants than this kingdom, for there are only about 7,000 of them all told. And if all the land in the kingdom were divided, there would not be an acre for each inhabitant. But in this toy kingdom there is a real kinglet, and he has a palace, and courtiers, and ministers, and a bishop, and generals, and an army. It is not a large army, only 60 men in all, but still it is an army. There were also taxes in this kingdom as elsewhere, a tax on tobacco and on wine and spirits, and a poll tax. But though the people there drink and smoke as people do in other countries, there are so few of them that the king would have been hard put to it to feed his courtiers and officials and to keep himself, if he had not found a new and special source of revenue. This special revenue comes from a gaming house, where people play roulette. People play, and whether they win or lose, the keeper always gets a percentage on the turnover, and out of his profits he pays a large sum to the king. The reason he pays so much is that it is the only such gambling establishment left in Europe. Some of the little German sovereigns used to keep gaming houses of the same kind, but some years ago they were forbidden to do so. The reason they were stopped was because these gaming houses did so much harm. A man would come and try his luck, and then he would risk all he had and lose it. Then he would even risk money that did not belong to him, and lose that too, and then, in despair, he would drown or shoot himself. So the Germans forbade their rulers to make money in this way. But there was no one to stop the King of Monaco, and he remained with the monopoly of the business. So now everyone who wants to gamble goes to Monaco. Whether they win or lose, the king gains by it. You can't earn stone palaces by honest labor, as the proverb said, and the kinglet of Monaco knows it is a dirty business. But what is he to do? He has to live, and to draw revenue from drink and tobacco is also not a nice thing. So he lives and reigns, and rakes in the money, and holds his court with all the ceremony of a real king. He has his coronation, his levees, his rewards, sentences, and pardons, and he also has his reviews, councils, laws, and courts of justice, just like other kings, only on a smaller scale. Now it happened a few years ago that a murder was committed in this toy king's domains. The people of that kingdom were peaceable, and such a thing had not happened before. The judges assembled with much ceremony and tried the case in the most judicial manner. There were judges and prosecutors and journeymen and barristers. They argued and judged, and at last they condemned the criminal to have his head cut off as the law directs. So far, so good. Next they submitted the sentence to the king. The king read the sentence and confirmed it. If the fellow must be executed, execute him. There was only one hitch in the matter, and that was that they had neither a guillotine for cutting heads off, nor an executioner. The ministers considered the matter, and decided to address an inquiry to the French government, asking whether the French could not lend them a machine and an expert to cut off the criminal's head, and if so, would the French kindly inform them what the cost would be. The letter was sent. A week later the reply came. A machine and an expert could be supplied, and the cost would be 16,000 francs. This was laid before the king. He thought it over. 16,000 francs! The wretch is not worth the money, said he. Can't it be done somehow cheaper? Why, 1,600 francs is more than 2 francs a head on the whole population. The people won't stand it, and it may cause a riot. So the council was called to consider what could be done. and it was decided to send a similar inquiry to the King of Italy. The French government is a republic and has no proper respect for kings. But the King of Italy was a brother monarch, and might be induced to do the thing cheaper. So the letter was written, and a prompt reply was received. The Italian government wrote that they would have pleasure in supplying both a machine and an expert, and the whole cost would be 12,000 francs, including traveling expenses. This was cheaper, but still it seemed too much. The rascal was really not worth the money. It would still mean nearly 2 francs more per head on the taxes. Another council was called. They discussed and considered how it could be done with less expense. Could not one of the soldiers perhaps be got to do it, in a rough and homely fashion? The general was called and was asked, "Can't you find us a soldier who would cut the man's head off? In war they don't mind killing people. In fact, that is what they are trained for." So the general talked it over with the soldiers, to see whether one of them would not undertake the job. But none of the soldiers would do it. "No," they said, "we do not know how to do it, and it is not a thing we have been taught." What was to be done? Again the ministers considered and reconsidered. They assembled a commission, and a committee, and a subcommittee, and at last they decided that the best thing would be to alter the death sentence to one of imprisonment for life. This would enable the king to show his mercy, and it would come cheaper. The king agreed to this, and so the matter was arranged. The only hitch now was that there was no suitable prison for a man sentenced for life. There was a small lock-up where the people were sometimes kept temporarily, but there was no strong prison fit for permanent use. However, they managed to find a place that would do, and they put the young fellow there, and placed a guard over him. The guard had to watch the criminal, and had also to fetch his food from the palace kitchen. The prisoner remained there month after month till a year passed, and when a year had passed, the kinglet, looking over the account of his income and expenditure one day, noticed a new item of expenditure. This was for the keep of the criminal. Nor was it a small item either. There was a special guard, and there was also the man's food. It came to more than 600 francs a year. And the worst of it was that the fellow was still young and healthy, and might live for 50 years. When one came to reckon it up, the matter was serious. It would never do. So the king summoned the ministers and said to them, "You must find some cheaper way of dealing with this rascal. The present plan is too expensive." And the ministers met and considered and reconsidered, till one of them said, "Gentlemen, in my opinion, we must dismiss the guard." "But then," rejoined another minister, "the fellow will run away." "Well," said the first minister, "let him run away, and be hanged to him." So they reported the result of their deliberations to the kinglet, and he agreed with them. The guard was dismissed, and they waited to see what would happen. All that happened was that at dinner-time the criminal came out, and not finding his guard, he went to the king's kitchen to fetch his own dinner. He took what was given him, returned to the prison, shut the door himself, and stayed inside. Next day the same thing occurred. He went for his food at the proper time, but as for running away, he did not show the least sign of it. What was to be done? They considered the matter again. "We shall have to tell him straight out," said they, "that we do not want to keep him." So the minister of justice had him brought before him. "Why do you not run away?" said the minister. "There is no guard to keep you. You can go where you like, and the king will not mind." "I dare say the king would not mind," replied the man, "but I have nowhere to go. What can I do? You have ruined my character by your sentence, and people will turn their backs on me. Besides, I have got out of the way of working. You have treated me badly. It is not fair. In the first place, when once you sentenced me to death, you ought to have executed me. But you did not do it. That is one thing. I did not complain about that. Then you sentenced me to imprisonment for life, and put a guard to bring me my food. but after a time you took him away again, and I had to fetch my own food. Again I did not complain, but now you actually want me to go away. I can't agree to that. You may do as you like, but I won't go away." What was to be done? Once more the council was summoned. What course could they adopt? The man would not go. They reflected and considered. The only way to get rid of him was to offer him a pension, and so they reported to the king. "There is nothing else for it," said they. "We must get rid of him somehow." The sum fixed was 600 francs, and this was announced to the prisoner. "Well," he said, "I don't mind as long as you undertake to pay it regularly. On that condition I am willing to go." So the matter was settled. He received 1/3 of his annuity in advance and left the king's dominions. It was only a quarter of an hour by rail, and he emigrated and settled just across the frontier, where he bought a piece of land, started market gardening, and now lives comfortably. He always goes at the proper time to draw his pension. Having received it, he goes to the gaming tables, stakes 2 or 3 francs, sometimes wins and sometimes loses, and then returns home. He lives peaceably and well. It is a good thing that he did not commit his crime in a country where they do not grudge expense to cut a man's head off, or to keeping him in prison.
The Coffee-House of Surat, Chapter 3 of Leo Tolstoy's What Men Live By and Other Stories, after Bernardine de Saint-Pierre. Read by Alan Davis Drake. In the town of Surat in India was a coffee-house where many travelers and foreigners from all parts of the world met and conversed. One day a learned Persian theologian visited this coffee-house. He was a man who had spent his life studying the nature of the deity and reading and writing books upon the subject. He had thought, read, and written so much about God that eventually he lost his wits, became quite confused, and ceased even to believe in the existence of God. The Shah, hearing of this, had banished him from Persia. After having argued all of his life about the first cause, this unfortunate theologian had ended by quite perplexing himself, and instead of understanding that he had lost his own reason, he began to think that there was no higher reason controlling the universe. This man had an African slave who followed him everywhere. When the theologian entered the coffee-house, the slave remained outside, near the door, sitting on a stone in the glare of the sun, driving away the flies that buzzed about him. The Persian, having settled down on a divan in the coffee-house, ordered himself a cup of opium. When he had drunk it, and the opium had begun to quicken the workings of his brain, he addressed his slave through the open door. "Tell me, wretched slave," he said, "do you think there is a God or not?" "Of course there is," said the slave, and immediately drew from under his girdle a small idol of wood. "There," he said, "that is the God who had guarded me from the day of my birth. Every one in my country worships the fetish tree, from the wood of which this God was made." This conversation between the theologian and his slave was listened to with surprise by the other guests in the coffee-house. They were astonished at the master's question, and yet more so at the slave's reply. One of them, a Brahmin, on hearing the words spoken by the slave, turned to him and said, "Miserable fool! Is it possible you believe that God can be carried under a man's girdle? There is one God, Brahma, and he is greater than the whole world, for he created it. Brahma is the one, the mighty God, and in his honor are built the temples on the Ganges River, where his true priests, the Brahmins, worship him. They know the true God, and none but they. 1,000 score of years have passed, and yet through revolution after revolution, these priests have held their sway, because Brahma, the one true God, has protected them." So spoke the Brahmin, thinking to convince everyone, but a Jewish broker who was present replied to him and said, "No, the temple of the true God is not in India, neither does God protect the Brahmin caste. The true God is not the God of the Brahmins, but of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. None does he protect but his chosen people, the Israelites. From the commencement of the world, our nation has been beloved of him, and ours alone. If we are now scattered over the whole earth, it is but to try us. For God has promised that he will one day gather his people together in Jerusalem. Then, with the temple of Jerusalem, the wonder of the ancient world, restored to its splendor, shall Israel be established a ruler over all nations." So spoke the Jew, and burst into tears. He wished to say more, but an Italian missionary who was there interrupted him. "What you are saying is untrue," he said to the Jew. "You attribute injustice to God. He cannot love your nation above the rest. Nay, rather, even if it be true that of old he favored the Israelites, it is now 1900 years since they angered him and caused him to destroy their nation and scatter them over the earth, so that their faith makes no converts and has died out except here and there. God shows preference to no nation, but calls all who wish to be saved to the bosom of the Catholic Church of Rome, the one outside whose borders no salvation can be found." So spoke the Italian. But a Protestant minister, who happened to be present, growing pale, turned to the Catholic missionary and exclaimed, "How can you say that salvation belongs to your religion? Those only will be saved who serve God according to the gospel, in spirit and in truth, as bidden by the word of Christ." Then a Turk, an office-holder in the custom-house at Surat, who was sitting in the coffee-house smoking a pipe, turned with an air of superiority to both Christians. "Your belief in your Roman religion is vain," he said. "It was superseded 1200 years ago by the true faith, that of Mohammed. You cannot but observe how the true Mohammed faith continues to spread both in Europe and Asia, and even in the enlightened country of China. You say yourselves that God has rejected the Jews, and, as proof, you quote the fact that the Jews were humiliated and their faith does not spread. Confess, then, the truth of Mohammedanism, for it is triumphant and spreads far and wide. None will be saved but the followers of Mohammed, God's latest prophet, and of them only the followers of Omar, and not of Ali, for the latter are false to the faith." To this the Persian theologian, who was of the sect of Ali, wished to reply, but by this time a great dispute had arisen among all the strangers of different faiths and creeds present. There were Abyssinian Christians, Lamas from Tibet, Ismailians, and fire-worshippers. They all argued about the nature of God and how he should be worshipped. Each of them asserted that in his country alone was the true God known and rightly worshipped. Everyone argued and shouted, except a Chinaman, a student of Confucius, who sat quietly in one corner of the coffee-house, not joining in the dispute. He sat there drinking tea and listening to what the others said, but did not speak himself. The Turk noticed him sitting there and appealed to him, saying, "You can confirm what I say, my good Chinaman. You hold your peace, but if you spoke, I know you would uphold my opinion. Traders from your country, who come to me for assistance, tell me that though many religions have been introduced into China, you Chinese consider Mohammedanism the best of all, and adopt it willingly. Confirm then my words, and tell us your opinion of the true God and of his prophet." "Yes, yes," said the rest, turning to the Chinaman. "Let us hear what you think of the subject." The Chinaman, the student of Confucius, closed his eyes and thought a while. Then he opened them again, and drawing his hands out of the wide sleeves of his garment and folding them on his breast, he spoke as follows in a calm, quiet voice. "Sirs, it seems to me that it is chiefly pride that prevents men agreeing with one another on matters of faith. If you care to listen to me, I will tell you a story which explains this by example. I came here from China on an English steamer which had been round the world. We stopped for fresh water and landed on the east coast of the island of Sumatra. It was midday, and some of us, having landed, sat in the shade of some coconut palms by the seashore, not far from a native village. We were a party of men of different nationalities. As we sat there, a blind man approached us. We learned afterwards that he had gone blind from gazing too long and too persistently at the sun, trying to find out what it is, in order to seize its light. He strove a long time to accomplish this, constantly looking at the sun, but the only result was that his eyes were injured by its brightness, and he became blind. Then he said to himself, "The light of the sun is not a liquid, for if it were a liquid it would be possible to pour it from one vessel to another, and it would be moved like water by the wind. Neither is it fire, for if it were fire, water would extinguish it. Neither is light a spirit, for it is seen by the eye. Nor is it matter, for it cannot be moved. Therefore, as the light of the sun is neither liquid, nor fire, nor spirit, nor matter, it is nothing." So he argued, and as a result of always looking at the sun and always thinking about it, he lost both his sight and his reason. And when he went quite blind, he became fully convinced that the sun did not exist. With this blind man came a slave, who, after placing his master in the shade of a coconut tree, picked up a coconut from the ground and began making it into a night-light. He twisted a wick from the fiber of the coconut, squeezed oil from the nut in the shell, and soaked the wick in it. As the slave sat doing this, the blind man sighed and said to him, "Well, slave, was I not right when I told you there was no sun? Do you not see how dark it is? Yet people say there is a sun. But if so, what is it?" "I do not know what the sun is," said the slave. "That is no business of mine. But I know what light is. Here I have made a night-light, by the help of which I shall serve you and find anything I want in the hut." And the slave picked up the coconut shell, saying, "This is my sun." A lame man with crutches, who was sitting near by, heard the words and laughed. "You have evidently been blind all your life," he said to the blind man, "not to know what the sun is. I will tell you what it is. The sun is a ball of fire which rises every morning out of the sea and goes down again among the mountains of our island each evening. We have all seen this, and if you had had your eyesight, you too would have seen it." A fisherman, who had been listening to the conversation, said, "It is plain enough that you have never been beyond your own island. If you were not lame, and if you had been out as I have in a fishing boat, you would know that the sun does not set among the mountains of our island, but it rises from the ocean every morning, so it sets again in the sea every night. What I am telling you is true, for I see it every day with my own eyes." Then an Indian who was of our party interrupted him by saying, I am astonished that a reasonable man should talk such nonsense. How can a ball of fire possibly descend into the water and not be extinguished? The sun is not a ball of fire at all. It is the deity named Deva, who rides forever in a chariot round the golden mountain Meru. Sometimes the evil serpents Ragu and Ketu attack Deva and swallow him, and then the earth is dark. But our priests pray that the deity may be released, and then he is set free. Only such ignorant men as you, who have never been beyond their own island, can imagine that the sun shines for their country alone. Then the master of an Egyptian vessel, who was present, spoke in his turn. "No," he said, "you also are wrong. The sun is not a deity and does not move only around India and its golden mountain. I have sailed much on the Black Sea and along the coasts of Arabia, and have been to Madagascar and the Philippines. The sun lights the whole earth and not India alone. It does not circle round one mountain, but rises far in the east, beyond the Isles of Japan, and sets far, far away in the west, beyond the islands of England. That is why the Japanese call their country Nippon, that is, the birth of the sun. I know this well, for I have myself seen much, and heard more from my grandfather, who sailed to the very ends of the sea." He would have gone on, but an English sailor from our ship interrupted him. "There is no country," he said, "where people know so much about the sun's movements as in England. The sun, as everyone in England knows, rises nowhere and sets nowhere. It is always moving round the earth. We can be sure of this, for we have just been round the world ourselves, and nowhere knocked up against the sun. Wherever we went, the sun showed itself in the morning and hid itself at night, just as it does here." And the Englishman took a stick and, drawing circles in the sand, tried to explain how the sun moves in the heavens and goes round the world. But he was unable to explain it clearly, and pointing to the ship's pilot said, "This man knows more about it than I do. He can explain it properly." The pilot, who was an intelligent man, had listened in silence to the talk till he was asked to speak. Now everyone turned to him, and he said, "You are all misleading one another, and you yourselves are deceived. The sun does not go round the earth, but the earth goes round the sun, revolving as it goes, and turning towards the sun in the course of each 24 hours. Not only Japan and the Philippines and Sumatra, where we now are, but Africa and Europe and America and many lands besides. The sun does not shine for some one mountain, or for some one island, or for some one sea, not even for one earth alone, but for other planets as well as our earth. If you could only look up at the heavens instead of at the ground beneath your own feet, you might all understand this, and would then no longer suppose that the sun shines for you or for your country alone." Thus spoke the wise pilot, who had voyaged much of the world and had gazed much upon the heavens above. "So, on matters of faith," continued the Chinaman, the student of Confucius, "it is pride that causes error and discord among men. As with the sun, so it is with God. Each man wants to have a special God of his own, or at least a special God for his native land. Each nation wishes to confine in his own temples him whom the world cannot contain. Can any temple compare with that which God himself has built to unite all men in one faith and one religion? All human temples are built in the model of this temple, which is God's own world. Every temple has its fronts, its vaulted roof, its lamps, its pictures or sculptures, its inscriptions, its books of law, its offerings, its altars, and its priests. But in what temple is there such a font as the ocean, such a vault as that of the heavens, such lamps as the sun, moon, the stars, or any figures to be compared with living, loving, mutually helpful men? Where are there any records of God's goodness so easy to understand as the blessings which God has strewn abroad for man's happiness? Where is there any book of the law so clear to each man as that written in his heart? What sacrifices equal to the self-denials which loving men and women make for one another? And what altar can be compared with the heart of a good man, on which God himself accepts the sacrifice? The higher a man's conception of God, the better will he know him, and the better he knows God, the nearer will he draw to him, imitating his goodness, his mercy, and his love of man. Therefore, let him who sees the sun's whole light filling the world refrain from blaming or despising the superstitious man, who in his own idol sees one ray of that same light. Let him not despise even the unbeliever, who is blind and cannot see the sun at all. So spoke the Chinaman, the student of Confucius, and all who were present at the coffee-house were silent, and disputed no more as to whose faith was the best. End of The Coffee-House of Surat by Leo Tolstoy, from What Men Live By and Other Stories.
Evil allures, but good endures, by Leo Tolstoy. Translation by Constance Garnett. Read by Alan Davis Drake. There lived in olden times a good and kindly man. He had his world's goods in abundance, and many slaves to serve him. And the slaves prided themselves on their master, saying, "There is no better lord than ours under the sun. He feeds and clothes us well, and gives us work suited to our strength. He bears no malice, and never speaks a harsh word to anyone. He is not like other masters, who treat their slaves worse than cattle, punishing them whether they deserve it or not, and never giving them a friendly word. He wishes us well, does good, and speaks kindly to us. We do not wish for a better life." Thus the slaves praised their lord, and the devil, seeing it, was vexed that the slaves should live in such love and harmony with their master. So getting one of them, whose name was Aleb, into his power, the devil ordered him to tempt the other slaves. And one day, when they were all sitting together resting and taking of their master's goodness, Aleb raised his voice and said, "It is stupid to make so much of our master's goodness. The devil himself would be kind to you if you did what he wanted. We serve our master well, and humor him in all things. As soon as he thinks of anything, we do it. Foreseeing all he wishes, what can he do but be kind to us? Just try how it will be if, instead of humoring him, we do some harm instead. He will act like any other. He will repay evil for evil, as the worst of masters do." The other slaves began denying what Aleb had said, and at last bet with him. Aleb undertook to make their master angry. If he failed, he was to lose his holiday garment, but if he succeeded, the other slaves were to give him theirs. Moreover, they promised to defend him against the master, and to set him free if he should be put in chains or imprisoned. Having arranged the bet, Aleb agreed to make his master angry next day. Aleb was a shepherd, and had in his charge a number of valuable purebred sheep, of which his master was very fond. Next morning, when the master brought some visitors into the enclosure to show them the valuable sheep, Aleb winked at his companions as if to say, See now how angry I will make him." All the other slaves assembled, looking in at the gates or over the fence, and the devil climbed a tree near by to see how his servants would do his work. The master walked about the enclosure, showing his guests the ewes and lambs, and presently he wished to show them his finest lamb. "All the rams are valuable," he said, "but I have one with closed, twisted horns, which is priceless. I prize him as the apple of my eye." Startled by the strangers, the sheep rushed about the enclosure, so that the visitors could not get a good look at the ram. As soon as it stood still, Aleb startled the sheep as if by accident, and they all got mixed up again. The visitors could not make out which was the priceless ram. At last the master got tired of it. "Aleb, my friend," he said, "pray catch our best ram for me, the one with the tightly twisted horns. Catch him very carefully, and hold him still for a moment." Scarcely had the master said this when Aleb rushed in among the sheep like a lion, and clutched the priceless ram. Holding him fast by the wool, he seized the left hind leg with one hand, and before his master's eyes lifted it and jerked it so that it snapped like a dry branch. He had broken the ram's leg, and it fell bleating on its knees. Then Aleb squeezed the right hind leg, while the left twisted round and hung quite limp. The visitors and slaves exclaimed in dismay, and the devil, sitting up in the tree, rejoiced and did not say a word. The visitors and slaves were silent too, waiting to see what would follow. After remaining silent for a while, the master shook himself as if to throw off some burden, and then he lifted his head and raised his eyes heavenward, remained for a short time. Presently the wrinkles passed from his face, and he looked down at Aleb with a smile, saying, "O Aleb, Aleb, your master bade you anger me, but my master is stronger than yours. I am not angry with you, but I will make your master angry. You are afraid that I shall punish you, and you have been wishing for your freedom. Know then, Aleb, that I shall not punish you, but as you wish to be free, here before my guests I set you free. Go where you like, and take your holiday garment with you." And the kind master returned with his guests to the house. But the devil, grinding his teeth, fell down from the tree and sank through the ground. End of Evil Allures, but Good Endures. Read by Alan Davis Drake. A Grain as Big as a Hen's Egg by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One day, some children found in a ravine a thing shaped like a grain of corn, with a groove down the middle, but as large as a hen's egg. A traveler passing by saw the thing, brought it from the children for a penny, and taking it to town, sold it to the king as a curiosity. The king called together his wise men and told them to find out what the thing was. The wise men pondered and could not make head or tail of it, till one day, when the thing was lying on a window-sill, a hen flew in and pecked at it till she made a hole in it, and every one saw that it was a grain of corn. The wise men went to the king and said, "It is a grain of corn." At this the king was much surprised, and he ordered the learned men to find out when and where such a corn had grown. The learned men pondered again and searched in their books, but could find nothing about it. So they returned to the king and said, "We can give you no answer. There is nothing about it in our books. You will have to ask the peasants. Perhaps some of them have heard from their fathers when and where grain grew to such a size." So the king gave orders that some very old peasant should be brought before him, and his servants found such a man and brought him to the king. Old and bent, ashy pale and toothless, he just managed, with the help of 2 crutches, to totter into the king's presence. The king showed him the grain, but the old man could hardly see it. He took it, however, and felt it with his hands. The king questioned him, saying, "Can you tell us, old man, where such grain as this grew? Have you ever bought such corn, or sown such in your fields?" The old man was so deaf that he could hardly hear what the king said, and only understood with great difficulty. "No," he answered at last, "I never sowed nor reaped any like it in my fields, nor did I ever buy such. When we bought corn, the grains were always as small as they are now. But you might ask my father. He may have heard where such grain grew." So the king sent for the old man's father, and he was found and brought before the king. He came walking with 1 crutch. The king showed him the grain, and the old peasant, who was still able to see, took a look at it, and the king asked him, "Can you tell us, old man, where corn like this used to grow? Have you ever bought any like it, or sown any in your fields?" Though the old man was rather hard of hearing, he still heard better than his son had done. "No," he said, "I never sowed nor reaped any grain like this in my field. As to buying, I never bought any, for in my time money was not yet in use. Every one grew his own corn, and when there was any need we would share with one another. I do not know where corn like this grew. Ours was larger and yielded more flour than present-day grain, but I never saw any like this. I have, however, heard my father say that in his time the grain grew larger and yielded more flour than ours. You had better ask him." So the king sent for this old man's father, and they found him too, and brought him before the king. He entered walking easily and without crutches. His eye was clear, his hearing good, and he spoke distinctly. The king showed him the grain, and the old grandfather looked at it and turned it about in his hand. "It is long since I have seen such a fine grain," he said, and he bit a piece off and tasted it. "It is the very same kind," he added. "Tell me, grandfather," said the king, "when and where was such corn grown? Have you ever bought any like it, or sown any in your fields?" The old man replied, "Corn like this used to grow everywhere in my time. I lived on corn like this in my young days, and fed others on it. It was grain like this that we used to sow and reap and thrash." And the king asked, "Tell me, grandfather, did you buy it anywhere, or did you grow it yourself?" The old man smiled. "In my time," he answered, "no one ever thought of such a sin as buying or selling bread, and we knew nothing of money. Each man had corn enough of his own." "Tell me, grandfather," asked the king, "where was your field? Where did you grow corn like this?" And the grandfather answered, "My field was God's earth. Whenever I plowed, there was my field. Land was free. It was a thing no man called his own. Labor was the only thing men called their own." "Answer me 2 more questions," said the king. "The first is, why did the earth bear such grain then, and has ceased to do now? And the second is, why your grandson walks with 2 crutches, your son with 1, and you yourself with none? Your eyes are bright, your teeth sound, and your speech clear and pleasant to the ear. How have these things come about?" And the old man answered, "These things are so because men have ceased to live by their own labor, and have taken to depending on the labor of others. In the old time men lived according to God's law. They had what was their own, and coveted not what others produced." End of A Grain as Big as a Hen's Egg.
Read by Alan Davis Drake. The Great Bear by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by R.S. Townsend. Read by Alan Davis Drake. A long, long time ago there was a big drought on the earth. All the rivers dried up, and the streams and the wells, and the trees withered, and the bushes and the grass, and men and beast died of thirst. One night a little girl went out with a pitcher to find some water for her sick mother. She wandered and wandered everywhere, but could find no water, and she grew so tired that she lay down on the grass and fell asleep. When she awoke and took up the pitcher, she nearly upset the water it contained. The pitcher was full of clear, fresh water. The little girl was glad and was about to put it to her lips, but she remembered her mother, and ran home with the pitcher as fast as she could. She hurried so much that she did not notice a little dog on her path. She stumbled over it and dropped the pitcher. The dog whined pitifully. The little girl seized the pitcher. She thought the water would have been upset, but the pitcher stood upright, and the water was there as before. She poured a little into the palm of her hand, and the dog lapped it and was comforted. When the little girl again touched the pitcher, it turned from common wood to silver. She took the pitcher home and gave it to her mother. The mother said, "I shall die just the same. You had better drink it." And she handed the pitcher to the child. At that moment the pitcher turned from silver to gold. The little girl could no longer contain herself, and was about to put the pitcher to her lips, when the door opened and a stranger entered, who begged for drink. The little girl swallowed her saliva, and gave the pitcher to him. And suddenly 7 large diamonds sprang out of the pitcher, and a stream of clear fresh water flowed from it. And the 7 diamonds began to rise, and they rose higher and higher, till they reached the sky, and became the Great Bear. End of The Great Bear by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Alan Davis Drake.